For every great game that comes out and is a hit, there are plenty of great games that fall through the cracks. If a masterful platformer, shooter, or beat-em-up is only available on a lesser-known system, what chance does that have? Then there are games that get a lot of love initially, but fade into memory once players move on to the next big thing. Even though the entries on this list are masterpieces, they've mostly been forgotten about, which is a huge shame. But we're here to remind you of them, or perhaps tell you about them for the very first time, so you can have an even bigger to-play pile. Sorry. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 forgotten masterpiece video games. Number 10, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy lovers are endlessly debating which game in the franchise is the best. You'll hear lots of people talking about Final Fantasy VII, plenty more talking about Final Fantasy VI, and then there are those who love 10 or 14, and that's totally fair enough as well. Yet, Final Fantasy XII is rarely spoken about with the same admiration, despite how beautifully crafted it is. It was bold to do away with the random encounters, but this decision gave players far more freedom in exploring. Square also made progress in Final Fantasy XII less reliant on grinding, which has been a major flaw in the series since day one. Even though the franchise regularly relies on nostalgia, Final Fantasy XII incorporates none of the iconic summoning monsters like Ifrit, Ramuh, or Bahamut. Instead, the creators devised all new creatures you could summon, and you could control them in the open world for the very first time. Even though modern games still struggle with AI partners, the Gambit system that governs the actions of the protagonist's teammates is easy to manage and incredibly efficient. Since the Zodiac Age remaster has been released on most systems in recent years, now is the perfect time to revisit Final Fantasy XII. Number 9, Virtua Fighter 4. Because Tekken, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Smash kind of dominate the fighting genre, it's really easy to forget about Virtua Fighter. Considering Sega's Punch Fest was the first 3D fighting game ever and laid the foundation for many beloved titles, it's a shame Virtua Fighter has been living in the shadows. If any entry in the series deserves more recognition, it's Virtua Fighter 4. Upon its release, there wasn't a single element that didn't receive universal praise. Like, even the tutorial was considered a work of art. This installment was touted the best fighting game since Street Fighter II due to its balanced roster, jaw-dropping realism, fluid movements, diverse fighting styles, and responsive controls. It's also really satisfying when you win a match, since success totally relies on your ability to block and pull off counterattacks, as opposed to dumb luck and button mashing. That does mean I wouldn't win any matches, but probably good if you're skilled. Virtua Fighter 4 was so ahead of its predecessors, it should have elevated the series overnight, allowing Sega's underrated franchise to finally stand shoulder to shoulder with the big dogs. But here we are over 20 years later, and Virtua Fighter 4 still remains underappreciated. Number 8, F-Zero GX. F-Zero GX gave gamers an experience unlike any other racing title. Mario Kart is heaps of fun, but there's nothing as exhilarating as zooming around a gravity-defying track while piloting a futuristic hovercraft at 1,000 miles per hour. Because the levels are surrounded by things like asteroids and lava, there's also a greater sense of urgency while you're racing, since each participant can die mid-race. Even though the series is renowned for its catchy tunes, Hidenori Shoji and Daiki Kasho outdid themselves here, creating some absolute head boppers. GX was also among the most graphically impressive titles on the GameCube, barely showing its age even after over 2 decades. Although GX did sell 1.5 million copies, which is obviously a lot of copies, Mario Kart Double Dash, which came out around the same time, sold quadruple that. Since it was clear where the money was going, it's easy to understand why Nintendo stayed with Mario Kart, while F-Zero was left in the dust. Sadly, GX was never re-released, giving racing fans little chance to give it a shot. Number 7, Lost Odyssey. On the surface, Lost Odyssey looks like a Final Fantasy clone. Not only does it have all the staples, Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was the head writer. But in a way, Lost Odyssey actually feels like Final Fantasy without some of its negative qualities. For example, gameplay feels more skill-focused instead of just spamming the same attacks. The aim ring system is simple in concept, but forces our heroes to align their attacks, keeping gamers engaged in every battle. Another way Lost Odyssey disassociates from Square's iconic series is its straightforward narrative. There are no plot twists, last-minute bait and switches, or unnecessarily complex subplots. Instead, the sprawling saga focuses on the main character's personal journey and explores their relationships with one another. Thanks to the magnificent voice acting, it's tough not to get immersed in the ensemble's conflicts and hardships. Even though Lost Odyssey is gargantuan, don't get us wrong, nothing really feels like filler here. Even outside of the main mission, it feels like the developers have put their heart and soul into every submission, so you feel like you want to complete them all. Since Lost Odyssey was only available on the Xbox 360, few people experienced this lost treasure. It's not easy to get a copy, but Lost Odyssey is definitely worth playing, especially for any RPG lover. Number 6. 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. In 9 Houses, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, college student Junpei is kidnapped alongside 8 strangers, then placed on a sinking cruiser where they're forced to take part in life or death tests. What makes this Nintendo DS title surpass other visual novels is how nerve-wracking it is. Every time a challenge is completed, things take a sudden 180 turn, a truth bomb is unleashed, or it turns out that somebody's betrayed you, so you're constantly on edge waiting for the next piece of the mystery to unravel itself. It's also refreshing to see that 9 Hours lacks many negative aspects of the genre, like pixel hunting, dead ends, and red herrings. We're looking at you, Grim Fandango. The puzzles are entertainingly diverse, demand a mix of logic, lateral thinking, and math, and the conundrums pose a fair challenge but never reach Monkey Island levels of frustration. Because there are 6 endings, 9 Hours has a huge replay factor. After the story mode's beaten, the player can fast forward sections upon the subsequent playthroughs, preventing the gameplay from getting tedious. Even though Phoenix Wright and Professor Layton are considered the kings of the visual novel genre, this one should definitely be up there too. Number 5. Nights into Dreams. The Sega Saturn bombed so quickly, it's genuinely impressive. But that doesn't mean this doomed console didn't have a couple of awesome titles, most notably Nights into Dreams. In this action platformer, 2 teenagers called Elliot and Clarice enter the dream world where they meet a character called Night. After taking control of Night, the player must soar through the sky in a predetermined route while passing through hoops and collecting orbs to maintain momentum. It might sound super simple, but Nights into Dreams requires a surprising amount of tactical thinking, since you have to constantly monitor your velocity, speed, and the time limit. Once the mechanics have been mastered though, performing acrobatic feats across the sky is a thrilling experience. With the vibrant colors, charming jingles, and incredible controls, getting through each level is a blast. Nights into Dreams may be brief, but gamers can't help coming back to it just to beat their old scores. Although Nights into Dreams didn't sell well initially, it could have made a comeback after the release of the sequel, Journey into Dreams. Sadly, this follow-up failed to recreate the magic, driving the original further into obscurity. Number 4. Vib-Ribbon. Vib-Ribbon follows a rabbit called Vibri who lives in a rhythm-based world called Music World. On his journey, the whimsical bunny comes across pits, blocks, loops, and waves which correspond to the beats of the track. To navigate through these obstacles, Vibri must press the corresponding button. As straightforward as that sounds, it gets tricky when the levels incorporate 2 obstacles into one, giving the player little time to figure out which combination of buttons to push. Vib-Ribbon has the potential to become absolutely unputdownable. Let's go with unputdownable, since it also responds to any CD you put into the console, like audio CD. Because the level design is based on the pulse of the song, the gameplay is only limited by the player's music collection. So if the player wants to navigate through a level based on the melody of You Belong With Me, Red, 22, Fortnite, or a song that's not by Taylor Swift, they can totally do that. Although Vib-Ribbon is staggeringly creative, its lack of popularity isn't much of a surprise. Due to its monochromatic design, wireframe aesthetic, and kiddie vibe, Vib-Ribbon was a hard sell. Unfortunately, when its 2 spin-offs sold badly as well, that kind of killed off the franchise for good. Number 3, Skies of Arcadia. In hindsight, it's baffling how the Dreamcast failed, considering how many of its games were so ahead of their time. Although Shenmue and Samba de Amigo eventually earned the recognition they deserved, Skies of Arcadia never got its due, despite being arguably the console's best title. Like many RPGs, the gameplay relies on turn-based battles, earning experience points, and getting your skills leveled up. However, Skies of Arcadia puts a much heavier focus on exploration. The map is initially blank, necessitating the player to navigate through the steampunk world to fill in their atlas. This gives the player the sense that they're rewarded for their curiosity, enticing them to scavenge for secret paths, allies, and hidden chests. Also, the random battles never get repetitive since they all require strategic planning and tactical engagement. Each encounter has our hero Vice and his squad spouting banter while unleashing their attacks, making the experience more entertaining and personal. Since airships play a huge part in the plot, it's neat how sky vessels are incorporated into battles. The ship-on-ship fights are epic as they allow Vice to command a crew and utilize a variety of innovative and devastating weapons. Despite being hailed as one of the best RPGs of all time, few people have even heard of Skies of Arcadia, let alone played it, and that's a darn shame. Number 2, Perfect Dark. Even though GoldenEye 007 was a landmark title, the James Bond shooter hasn't aged well. Seriously, the controls are much worse than you remember. The same can't be said about GoldenEye's spiritual sequel, Perfect Dark. Despite having the same structure, this rare title had an original storyline, and incorporated many mechanics that the Bond adaptation lacked, including double feature weapons, voice acting, elaborate cutscenes, a shooting range, and most importantly, cheese. With the advances of the Nintendo 64's expansion pack, gameplay also got a hell of a lot smoother, and words cannot describe how darn good that soundtrack is. Sadly, Perfect Dark lacked one thing that GoldenEye 007 had in spades, and that's brand recognition. Being a new property, Perfect Dark couldn't sell the same as its predecessor, since GoldenEye 007 was based on one of the most widely recognized IPs. The prequel and remaster were decent, but they didn't quite match up to that magical of the original, leaving the Perfect Dark series pretty dead in the water. Since there hasn't been another installment in 13 years and the announced reboot is in development hell, it's easy to forget what an impact Perfect Dark originally had. Number 1, Planescape Torment. There aren't a lot of games that are so ahead of their time in the way that Planescape Torment was. Although there are games like BioWare's Mass Effect and Dragon Age, which are heralded for how they allow the player to make choices, Planescape Torment was doing that all the way back in 1999. Even though the best games of that era had a simple storyline, Torment has a behemoth narrative that deals with obscure concepts like mortality, transcendence, interdimensional travel, and manifesting reality through thought. Torment tries to balance so many ideas it could easily collapse under its own weight, and yet the gothic roleplayer never wavers, weaving a magnificent story filled with philosophical musings, fascinating character arcs, and solid gallows humor. Every time you solve one of the game's captivating puzzles, a bunch of various paths are unlocked, which lets you explore even more gorgeously terrained areas. As monumental as Torment is, it saves its best ideas for last. The mind-blowing twist, the glorious final boss, and the heart-wrenching ending is enough to stay with anyone forever. In a nutshell, Planescape Torment is an unparalleled masterpiece that doesn't just raise the bar for storytelling and world building, but gaming in general.